Hello and welcome to another 5-minute Bible study. I'm Carl Santos, pastor of New City Church in Calgary. Today we're taking a quick look at the book of Nahum, which is a book among the minor prophets in the Old Testament, and it's often misunderstood. In fact, not only misunderstood, it's often not even read by a lot of Christians. So we're going to take a quick look at how this book opens and what it means for us as we begin to interact with the depiction of God that's in it by this prophet Nahum. So, before jumping into the context of why this book was written and when, which is vitally important, not just for this book, for any book of the Bible, I want to look at this text and underline some key words in it. So we're going to walk through it, and I'm going to underline in red all the words that refer to some, what we would call a negative aspect of God's character. Not negative because it's bad, but negative because it's kind of mean and it sounds terrifying. So these parts of God that show his anger towards Nineveh. Okay, let's read it. An oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum of Elkosh. The Lord is a jealous and an avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. So obviously Nahum is presenting God as angry with Nineveh. He is coming with pure wrath in his heart for Nineveh. And the question is, why? But before we get into why, something else is worth noting. We often hear that the Old Testament God is the angry God, and that the good, nice God shows up in the New Testament in Jesus. And they contrast these two as if these are two separate gods. Let me be clear. That comes from a fundamental lack of understanding of the Bible. And I don't believe anyone who makes that claim actually has studied or paid any attention to the Old Testament and the New Testament and how they speak together. But even here in this text, Nahum makes it clear about the complexity of God and what it means to be God, that he's not two-dimensional, and he doesn't just simply fall into, comic book depictions of good and evil. And look at verse 3. So look at it. The Lord is slow to anger. So why, amidst all of this talk about negativity, do we find this incredible contrast? Why does Nahum point to this vengeful and wrathful, this angry side of God, but then also point to this patient side of God right in the middle of it, saying he's angry, but he's patient? Why is that? And the answer comes in the context. So if you look at why this and when this book was written, you'll know the answer. This book was written by Nahum 100 years after Jonah had visited Nineveh. Nineveh met Jonah. Jonah prophesied and told them, you have to repent because God is angry with Assyria and their capital city, Nineveh, and he's going to bring judgment on them. So the city repented and everything looked good for them at the end of the book of Jonah. But 100 years later, Nahum shows up to tell them, look, you had your chance. God sent you a prophet when he didn't have to, and he's given you 100 years, and you have not turned your life around. You remain sinful, and so God is slow to anger, and he's reminding them of that. So this whole story is about God's coming to eventually bring justice to a city that has fallen away from him. Now, what this book will do, if you read it and you take it seriously, is it's going to force you to answer a lot of questions, or at least to consider them. Let's look at them. First question it's going to ask you to consider is, what is justice? What does it mean for a holy God to live amongst an unholy people? At what point does God step in and say, I cannot allow this to continue? And then what form does that take? Does it have to take a form of in a peaceful way? Does it have to be forceful? Does it always have to be destruction of a nation? And when you consider that, think about how any people group are made free if they've been captives. Slaves can only be made free if the slave master is dealt with. And that could be by peaceful means, but as we've seen in human history, often it's by forceful means. So what does that mean? That the destruction of one people is actually the joy and deliverance of another people. And that is a hard thing to think about and complex, but it's something that you have to wrestle with as you encounter this book. Another thing you've got to think about is, what does it mean to be in a world haunted by a sovereign God? Okay? If God is sovereign, then what does it mean that he holds sway over everything? What does that mean? What are the limits of it? And this book will help you understand that. And lastly, this book will also help you understand, what does it mean to be an enemy of God? What does an enemy of God look like? and what is the consequences of being an enemy of God? And there's so much more going on in this book, but that's all we have time for. So I hope you enjoyed this quick look, and I hope you jump into the book of Nahum.